My name is Peng, and I'm a media artist. I do various things, and some of the things I do curation, art, and teaching as well. But I guess most of what I do centers around art and technology, as well as ecology.
Hi, I'm Finn. I'm a multidisciplinary artist whose background is in architecture. My practice operates between photography and film and digital media. And I'm particularly interested in documenting the peripherals of the city and the unseen aspects of the built environment.
Hi, I'm Fiona. I'm an architect and also an installation artist. I'm interested in the blurring of boundaries between art and architecture, culture and community. I see temporary architecture as a very important and necessary counterpoint to that of the permanent.
I was actually a third party here. So I received like a text from Fiona one day asking about this project. And she was asking if I was interested to work together.
Yeah, so we worked together for quite a lot of projects, architectural, temporary installation, and I also have worked with Bin on more multimedia interactive works together with Randy. But it's really interesting to kind of come together, the three of us, to do this. And I think we were really interested in the brief and to take this space as a blank canvas to really experiment with the space itself and bring in each of our interests and expertise together. So I knew where the Goethe-Institut was, but I never knew that this space itself existed, and it's tucked away around the side of the building, and it's a small door. You don't really know it exists, and then when you step inside, it's quite amazing to be transported. So going from the brightness outside, say, into this really dark interior, it really hits you, I think. And again, when you leave the space, it transports you away from the context of where we are. And I think it's quite unusual within this area to have a space like this.
Since we were talking about this dialectics between the inside and the outside, I thought of Plato's cave or the allegory, where he used the cave as a metaphor. In it, he was talking about how these people living in the cave formed and only had this very narrow reality that was a shadow casted by the fire, right? And that was their own narrow reality that was very different from the real world outside. So we kind of saw that, or rather we were inspired by that, and kind of taking a reverse stance in looking at that with this space where we wanted to have the reality from the outside coming and seeping into this space. And our initial title was actually, how can we see anything but shadows? Right? Yes. And that has sort of evolved many times into soft realities.
Yeah, so I think the long title that we had, the working title, How Can We See Anything But Shadows, was really something that inspired us to the whole process of the making. We are not so much interested in the object and the physicality of something as much as the shadows that it casts. And using the shadows, we try to distort the space to create new perceptions of what reality could mean to someone.
I guess we could interpret this basement space as an urban cave of sorts. And I think our interpretation of the cave came through in the materiality and how we manipulated the space here through the wrapping, reflections, and the materiality of how light falls. It draws some reference to the urban cave and the natural cave, and there's a kind of merging of scenes from both of these.
Conceptually, I think the three of us are very interested in materials that are rather immaterial in nature. So separately and quite serendipitously, I think all of us love the idea of cling wrap spaces, the idea of using fabrics that you can pull and transform the dimension of the space. But technically as well, we want to be able to create space and dimensions beyond the walls of the Goethe's confined floor plans. So by allowing the draping of the cloth or the shrink wraps and the painted sheets outside of the confines of the walls, it made sense to have a scaffold. So the scaffold allows us different coordinates of wrapping. So in the sense, quite a lot of the process was when the three of us comes into the space, we view this space like a three-dimensional canvas with the scaffolds as the grid lines, and almost like one person is on the leather, then the other two would be like, okay, move the scaffold and stretch the cloth somewhere else. And that's kind of how we conceive this space, almost like a spider making a organic web through the basement.
Yeah, for me personally, I was interested to work with very intangible materials and form. You know, you have these awesome lights here, and me being the techie, geeky guy, I was like really excited and just started playing all the lights. So I ended up like doing the lighting design in the space. So again, that was accidental, but in a nice way. In the soundscape, there was a mixture between spaced out sounds and more tangible sounds where you can clearly discern what they are and where they come from. And so it's really a mixture of this idea of something outside and something inside, with the airy, spacey sound representing the interior and the more tangible sounds representing the outside.
In the space, there is this three-dimensional sphere that is made out of a few spheres that kind of rotate around each other. So these were just interpretations of fragments of memories in my own personal captures and maybe things from the street around. And I think the idea of it was to also overlay fragments of cutouts. And for the laser cuts, they actually talk about the idea of abstracting the streetscape around Goethe, but in a way that you only leave windows into the space, just as much as how the basement's only connection to the outside is through the bars in the windows. Yeah.
So all the visual projections around the space are based on sight recordings through the apertures in the space looking up towards the street, be it the sky or the people moving. And these are very small glimpses of the outside world as seen from within. And these have been manipulated. So for instance, on the floor here, we have the reflections of the outside as if the space was wet, seen through the climatics of the rain. And that's something which really interests me in terms of capturing the visual climatics of this tropical climate and the way the rain can distort that perception. So when water runs down the glass of the windows, it distorts that reality which you can see. So here we have the streetscape distorted through the lens of water and the droplets. And this works with Kian Peng's audio soundscape, which was recorded during these very rainy days, which we had when we were here on the site. And as you walk through the space, you also hear it from the crinkles of the plastic as well. It almost sounds like water. And even, say, the pipes of the basement is where all the water kind of flows down and through. So when it rains, you really feel that.
So I think as you walk through the space, you would notice certain abstractions or fragments that are not just in forms of shadows or projections, but also physical cutouts. The intent of these cutouts are not to emphasize on the cutout itself as much as it is the shadows that they cast when they overlay amongst each other. Actually, it was a very intentional decision between the three of us not to have any text and any descriptors in the space. So what we actually wanted was for a person to kind of wander through the space, to sit in the space like what we're doing here, and to just hear the lights, the sound, the shadow, and look at the world, in this hyper-real world around them in a different way before they leave the basement.
But one thing that we did consciously try to do is to make them surrender to the space in a way. Like the moment they step into the space, they have to like kind of like navigate their way, like bowing, like squatting down or bowing down, lowering their bodies to begin to enter the space. Kind of like how, you know, in Japanese tea houses, they have like really tiny doors. Not that they can't measure, but it's really a deliberate choice to make people lower down and sort of like forget their standings and just be in this space on a level kind of playing ground. So for us, that was an interesting entry point or way to think about the space, where we want them to sort of forget this idea of being in this, you know, traditional white cube gallery where you just enter the space and you see everything at once. But rather we want them to encounter, we want them to navigate, explore. So that's really kind of one of the aims that we have, to make them wander around, explore, and create new meanings for themselves. Yeah.
I think it's important for the audience not to see this as a typical gallery exhibition where you have like tape to tell you not to touch the artwork, not to lie on the floor, not to talk too loudly. I think the point of the work is to create a space where it's already noisy but yet intimate, and it has these strange encounters as you go around. You navigate the string wrap in your own way. You're allowed to touch, you're allowed to lie in the space and spend as long as you like. Yeah, so the work does continue to change across time. I think also amongst the three of us, whenever we come into the space, we may suddenly feel like, okay, let's hang a bit more, let's put a bit more string wrap and add on into the space. So in a way, it was quite an interesting experience doing a 3-dimensional collage with 3 different artists, and yet not each having our own space of influence, but really converging all our different interests together. So the overlay forms a rather interesting outcome that is always constantly evolving.
One of our first meetings, Fiona had drawn up a CAD plan, and we had tried to arrange like where the walls or the wrappings were going to be, and
We realized it doesn't work.
yeah. So it was
Yeah.
interesting to see like how we tried to imagine it and how it actually developed. It changed. Yeah.
I think one thing was interesting was that, well, if we look at conventionally how people collaborate with each other, there are always distinct tasks and distinct roles, or maybe even in creating a building, right? There are always blueprints that tell you precisely where each space will be. But I think what was interesting for me working with Bin and Finn was that we realized that all these floor plans can be ditched, because when you're really in the space and you start to understand each other's composition and respect and trust each other's artistic eye, you create something really different and unexpected. So I would say most of the work is quite unexpected rather than planned.
Yeah, and just a quick comment about that. I think it's quite rare to have such fluid collaborations, because normally, you know, artists have a lot of ego, and they all want to have their say, or, you know, they want to emphasize on their points or specialties. And so I think in that sense, we have a really good fluid relationship in this project. So that was, I thought that was really nice.
Yeah. Of course, this is also made possible because Goethe, as open core, was also rather flexible in allowing us to experiment and try these things. Yeah. So even before the opening, we may not actually know the exact outcome of how it looks like. And I think that's the charm that doesn't come quite often in a lot of our other projects. Yeah.